Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the National Food Waste Strategy Feasibility Study Update webinar. A bit of a mouthful there. Hosted by the Food and Agribusiness Growth Centre, trading as FIAL, and supported by Edge Environment and Life Cycles. I'll shortly hand you over to FIAL General Manager of Food Sustainability, Carolyn Cameron, who will officially welcome you all. Please note that we have some designated time at the end of the presentations for some Q&A today, so please send your questions directly to me via the chat function below, and we'll endeavour to answer as many of your questions as possible. Over to you now, Carolyn.
Hopefully, I am sharing my screen.
Yeah, that's all good. We got you.
Okay, cool. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted that you could all join us today. We're really glad to be able to take you through some of our interim results of the National Food Waste Strategy Feasibility Study. This has a project that's been underway for almost a year now, and it will give you some good insights into some updated information on the baseline and other aspects. But before we get into that, I wanted to tell you a bit about FIAL and some of the work that it's been doing over the last year. So one of the FIAL's looked at what needs to happen to grow Australia's food and agribusinesses over the next 10 years in Project 2030, and to double it and to look at the different types of industries, what could happen and what needs to happen if that growth is going to occur. In doing that, they looked at 19 different opportunities, and these opportunities were about the types of food people eat, health and wellness, targeted eating, but it also was about how you create food and some of the problems along the way. And you can see here that food loss and waste was one of the top 10 ways of capturing value of existing production and ensuring that it is actually used for food. It is food, let's use it for food. And the way that the Project 2030 did this process was to develop roadmaps for each one of the identified opportunities. So this being food loss and waste, because that's what we're looking at today. There were, the process looked at what's the current state, what's the future state, and what are the types of things you need to do to get there over the different horizons between 2020 and 2030. So three kind of big goals for food waste overall would be the higher percentage of food waste is diverted to tackle food insecurity. Households in the industry have embedded best practice to reduce waste generation and increase value capture from products derived from food waste streams. So that's a kind of nice balance of thinking about the types of programs and ways we should look at food waste. But if we're going to do that, we actually need to know where we're starting from. And that was documented in a roadmap prepared by FIAL from 2017 to 2020. FIAL was the independent organization supporting the national government in the National Food Waste Strategy and implementing that strategy, and prepared several different documents to assist with that, one of which was this roadmap. Some of you have probably seen it, and some of you hopefully have a copy that you carry with you. But it's about looking at the different types of activities. One of the key activities that was identified in the roadmap was the necessity for a feasibility study. A feasibility study to really understand where the hotspots and opportunities for food waste reduction are in Australia. The total impacts in terms of greenhouse gas, water, and land, and cost to society, and opportunity of benefit, and doing some of that. So FIAL, demonstrating its leadership, this time last year commenced the feasibility study. We've had one webinar, some of you might have attended that, and we'll have a further webinar announce our results and our suggestions in June. But today we're going to talk with our consultants. The FIAL's been working very closely with the consultants led by EDGE, a consortium of Life Cycles and WRAP from the UK and FIAL from the UK. But today we're going to hear from Max from EDGE, who's the lead consultant. Then we're going to have a conversation with the Life Cycles team. And they've been doing the hard yakka of updating the baseline. And Paul Antoine will go through the facts and figures on that. And then Tim Grant will talk about what has that told them about hotspots, applying the UN's hotspot analysis techniques. What are the different groups? And where across the supply chain are those hotspots in terms of not just waste, but also greenhouse gas, water, land, and cost. Then Max is going to pop back in and talk about the different scenarios that we have kind of developed and the interventions that comprise those scenarios. There are 47 interventions. Don't worry, we're not going to talk about all of them, but it'll give you an idea about the breadth of things that you can do to reduce food waste and what that will tell you about what the impacts might be from each one of those. So I'm going to turn over to Max, and I'm going to stop sharing if I can, and let Max then take it from here.
Thank you, Carolyn. Hopefully you can all see this. Just a quick status update. It's great to see some familiar faces on the call, or familiar virtual faces or avatars or whatever they are on these Zoom meetings. And yeah, thanks for checking in on this project. We have a decent update for you today, but we're also not far off the scenario. So I'll talk you through where we're up to in terms of the project status. We have updated the national food waste baseline, so Tim will share that today with you. We've also mapped the hotspots against that baseline. So basically, just a reminder, the brief for our project is, can we have food waste in Australia by 2030, and if so, how? Pretty simple brief. There's a few other bits and pieces across that, but can we have food waste in Australia by 2030, and if so, how? In order to do that, first of all, we needed to develop an updated baseline of the food waste across Australia. We need to identify the hotspots in that baseline, and we needed to design out scenarios that look forward out to 2030. What are the different levers by which we can address these food waste hotspots? Once we've identified those levers, we have to match interventions to those various different scenarios. We have to undertake a cost-benefit analysis for that, and then develop up the final report. So the final report will be ready for FIAL about probably around June time, and will be shared with you most likely in the new financial year. Now, or maybe slightly earlier. Today we're going to go through those first three elements. We are well progressed in terms of the impact of those scenarios. We just aren't quite ready to share with you the outcome of those scenarios in terms of how they may or may not meet those targets, but we aren't far off that. But that will obviously be included in the final report. So I will hand it over to. I'm going to stop sharing now. I'll hand it over to Paul and Tim to talk you through the baseline and the hotspots.
It's Max and Caroline. Let me just bring up our screen here. So you see the whole screen. Share. Okay, Paul and Tron.
Start with the busiest slide of all. So I just wanted to start with showing a little bit of our approach in updating the food waste baseline. So one of the big difference between the previous version and this is that we, being life cycle assessment practitioner, we've taken a whole of supply chain approach to modeling the food waste baseline. And we use this kind of rough map to structure our model, where we link up the primary production to the processing, taking into account that there can be different stages of processing, and then onto the retail and consumption stage. All the data we used is representative of financial year 2019. That was what was available at the time. And so using this whole supply chain approach means that we can take into account the mass balance to make sure that things flow through the supply chain as they do in reality. So we keep check of import, exports, the amount of primary production that's actually dedicated to animal feeding rather than food production, losses, and actual production for domestic human consumption. So this is kind of how we worked around this, and we had a really good coverage of primary production with 117 commodities considered in the analysis. If I just take this. So I'll just go through some of the changes step by step in the supply chain quickly to give you an idea of what we've done, like the sort of progress we've made on calculating the baseline. So at the primary level, we've updated all the waste fractions of fruit and vegetable from a recent CSR study. We have new horticultural production data, which is sourced from Hort Innovation. We have updated figures for sugarcane loss on fields, which is from a recent on-farm trial research. And that's quite significant because we produce so much sugarcane. It's the biggest crop in Australia. For the other commodities, we use the range of source for the data, either from statistical data sets from the Australian Bureau of Statistics or the Bureau of Agricultural and Resource Economics and Science, or from industry data directly from Dairy Australia, the Sugar Milling Council, MLA, etc. For the processing, so our model consider that processing starts once the harvest is done. So the examples of process that we included in our model are storage for grains, for instance, grading for fruit and vegetable, crushing for sugarcane, shelling and hulling for nuts, etc. We have, as I've shown in the diagram earlier, we have up to 3 levels of processing that are considered for each commodity. So that means that, for instance, a commodity like wheat might go through a phase of storage, milling phase to make flour, and then making baked goods out of that, or making pasta, or making biscuits, or things like that. We also consider imports and exports, which was not previously done. And one of the things that allows us to do is to consider commodities which are not produced in Australia, but that are processed in Australia and consumed in large quantities. So, the best example that I could think of is coffee. We love our coffee here in Australia, and we import a lot of green coffee, which is then roasted here, and there's a loss associated with that. In terms of updated numbers, we had some new data from the wine industry in terms of how they manage the byproducts of wine production. We had some new data for the fruit and vegetable sector. We also had some good discussion with the dairy sector and updated the model there. So there was a lot of updating and adding information to the model. I'm going to skip distribution because it's actually very similar to what was done in the previous model. But when we go to wholesale and retail, we increase the breadth of supermarket chains that are included in the model. So it's more representative. And we also, along with data that was collected from the supermarkets. We included data from a recent audit conducted by Sustainability Victoria, which added information on the more small fruit and vegetable stores, small grocery stores, etc. So that sort of added a more rounded view of the retail sector. Then households, the major update is that we included home composting and waste to sewer in the model. So that wasn't there previously, and that was sourced from a recent study funded by the Fight Food Waste CRC. And then all the waste from landfill is based on data published by the states, which is a similar approach to previously, and the FOGO streams also based on state reported data. Hospitality is basically a completely different model, but it's all based on a recent audit study from Sustainability Victoria. It's the same one as the one we've used in retail. They did the study on both the food services and grocery stores, so that was quite handy. And the institution sector is relatively similar to what was done previously, but with some updates, particularly on schools and hospitals. So that's a summary of the updates. This is the results that we get at the moment. So the total figure, if I'm not wrong, is 7.6 million ton. That's distributed across primarily the primary production, processing, and the consuming side of the supply chain are the three major contributors to that, with household being the biggest contributor, representing 32% of total food wastes, and then primary and processing and hospitality in that order. If we compare it to, I'm sorry, I've got everybody's face on my slides. If we compare it to what came out of the 2019 study, it's kind of a relatively similar overall figure, but there's some variations across the supply chain, and there's some interesting stories. So, for instance, the primary production sector decreased by 25%, 26%, but that's mainly due to well, it's partly due to broadacre crops, the production being so much lower in 2019, in financial year 2019, which is the year of our data, compared to the year of reference of the 2019 study. So that really drives the difference. The hospitality number being so much higher, due to using a more recent study, and the wholesale and retail being quite a bit higher too, I think, because we not only included the major supermarket brands which have, maybe good systems in place, but also everything else, which sort of balances those numbers a bit. And in terms of where this waste goes, you can see some shift between the 2019 and the 2021 study. So the big changes are the on-farm disposal, and that's a similar reason. Well, there's two reasons. One is the broadacre crop being so much lower, and therefore those numbers going down. There's also some of the updates that we've done, particularly on the horticultural sector, using the CSIRO survey study, which meant that some crops went down in terms of the volume of waste on farm. Wastewater treatment goes significantly up, and that's because we include household waste to sewer, which was not included before. And similarly with the home/on-site composting is significantly higher because we include the waste at the household that goes to composting at home. Just to some quick comparison of sectors. Excuse me. So what I'm talking about is kind of exemplified here, where you can see the wastes of the broadacre crop going down significantly, and that's I think the production of, for instance, wheat, which is the major broadacre crop, was halved between the year of our year of reference and the year of reference used in 2019. So that really drives the numbers down. And with the fruits and vegetable side of thing, the variation is due to both using new, more complete data on production and using updated data on the wastage rates on farm. If we look at manufacturing, and I've only included the top 6 sectors because I wanted to include beer making because everybody loves that. So you can see some of the variations here that are significant in dairy and wine sector, particularly. So that's the dairy sector is based on, I think, having more conversations and better understanding the dairy production sector for this model. And also the fact that we use the mass balance approach means that we could have a level of certainty that everything was included, so we knew what comes in and what came out had to match that. So we had a good level of confidence in those numbers. And the wine production sector is also based on discussions we've had with the industry in terms of what is typically done with some of the outputs of the wine production. And that really drove the figures down because of the fact that they were doing more with their output than we thought. And it's a similar thing across, really. I don't want to spend too much time on it. In terms of, so the other aspect that's important that I showed in the previous diagram of the overall supply chain results is the consumption side of things. And you can see the wholesale and retail going up significantly in this assessment. And as I said, it's because we have, I think, a broader range of data that represents wider context. Like it represents better the retail sector than it used to do, I think. Partly because we don't only include major supermarkets, but also small shops. Household is actually quite similar, and that's interesting because I think the landfill figure went down, but then we added sewer and home composting, and it went back up to a similar number. And food services went significantly up due to using the recent audit data from Sustainability Victoria, the food services sector. I think that's me for the brief update on the baseline, and I'll hand over to Tim.
Thanks, Antoine, and thanks for your hard work putting that together. Some of the other things that are not in the data there, but there was some improvements in data measurements of data quality, and also the referencing of sort of tracing back to references and studies within the actual baseline, which I assume will be shared with the broader public at some point. So the hotspots, so taking that information from the food waste baseline, we basically did a life cycle assessment, a cradle to grave study on 18 typical food chains that covered the main food groups that we have within Australia. And we have that production chain and all the impacts of fertilizers and growing and harvesting and across the supply chain, including waste estimates at each point of the supply chain. So how much material is being wasted, and also the impacts of the waste destination, whether that be going to landfill or composting, on-farm disposal. Also in the model are what you might call non-waste destinations of excess materials, such as reuse and valorisation in different forms. With that model, we would run that model for each of the 18 commodities with waste switched on and switched off at each production stage, from primary through to manufacturing, distribution. And what that gives us is the net impact of food waste at each stage of the model, which includes the impacts of making food which isn't utilised, all the upstream impacts. So if you waste food at the household level, all of the upstream impacts that went into manufacturing that, as well as the impacts of disposing of or somehow treating waste created at that stage. We did that for 18 commodities. We grouped them then into 4 main food groups based on the sort of types of waste that occur. So animal products, refrigerated, generally lasting maybe a few days to a few weeks. Bread being its own category because it is so short term and so specialised, and it lasts around 1 or 2 days. And your bread, so it's unique, and there's a lot of it. Fruit and vegetables, all fresh fruit and vegetables, and then shelf-stable products, cereals, nuts, and we added this new category called complex products, which is really everything that doesn't fit into the above. So what does a packaged pizza look like? Where does it fit? It's a complex product. It has bits of everything else in it. And so we identified at what parts of these earlier models were actually going into, say, fresh food sales, and what is actually going into complex food manufacture. So you'll see complex foods pop up as a hotspot sometimes because it has a lot of everything else in it. So we built that model, and within it we assess the total amount of waste being created, the climate change impacts, water scarcity impacts, which is really the water use across the supply chain, multiplied by how scarce water is in the region where it's being used. So the Murray-Darling Basin water is there is more water stress than there is, say, in North Queensland tropical areas. What that gives us is, and this is the results of the impact distribution by our 5 impact categories. I forgot to mention we also included land occupation and cost, as in the cost of materials being wasted. And what it gives us is a distribution of these impacts across the supply chain by category, and this is for all impacts, all foods that there are. And don't try and match this to the food waste baseline. It doesn't match exactly because we were using 18 foods to represent all foods, but in the food waste baseline there was 117 commodities being modelled. Here we had 18 typical commodities that tried to emulate that. So there will be some small differences, but they were sort of aligned. And what we can see immediately is that, okay, there is a lot of waste at household. You can see there's sort of roughly half of the waste sitting in the consumption stages. But in terms of environmental impact, there is significantly more environmental impact here than there is waste. So the consequences of waste at this stage are actually higher than the consequences of waste at these early stages. Here we're getting 20% of waste, but it's only 3.3% of the total climate change impact of that food waste. And so that really represents this compounding effect of when you waste something here, the fraction you waste also had its own waste through the supply chain and impacts through that supply chain. So if we are going to waste early and not late, and of course we don't want to waste anywhere, but it sort of says there is real value in reducing waste at these endpoints because of the supply chain effects of that. So that's all impact categories, and that's their sort of rough distribution. We then use this hotspot method developed by the Life Cycle Initiative, which is hosted by UN Environment Program, which gives it very much an international legitimacy. It is a process where, do I have this twice? Yes, I do. This is the one I wanted. What the UN method says is that hotspots are really defined as a place in supply chain where you have a greater share of impact than would normally be there if impact was evenly distributed across the sort of mass flow. A warm spot is where you have roughly average impact, and a cool spot is where you have lower than average impact across a supply chain. We had to play around a little bit. When they say above, how much above? A little bit above, a lot above. We played around with those thresholds of what constitutes a hot spot and a warm spot to try and get a nice visual on, so that everything doesn't end up a hotspot. It doesn't help you if you have 50% of places being a hotspot and 50% being a cool spot. It doesn't give you very much prioritization. So you'll see we play around with the thresholds for the hot and warm spots across the different supply chains. If we look at, so this table here, if you take that exact table and you apply the hotspot methodology, what you find is that the household hospitality institutions are hot. And there is, that is partly this compounding effect. It is also the fact that the rates of loss at these, in these consumption stages are actually higher than they are in the earlier stages. We have a little warm spot down here in primary production in terms of the total volume of waste, but a lot of that waste, has lower impact. It's maybe composted, left on farm, and it also doesn't have any further upstream impacts because it's at the start of the process. So what we then can do is we can dig down. So if we dig down and we just looked at the waste impacts, so here we're looking at waste, climate, water, land, cost. Let's focus on waste for a moment and break it up into our 4 categories. And we can see we have hotspots in hospitality for animal products and also shelf-stable products in terms of total waste. And that's a combination of how much we actually, those products make up that area, but also how much is actually wasted in those segments. We can dig down further and go down to the 18 food group level and get more resolution on where the hot and warm spots are sitting. And so in the animal products, milk is a big hotspot for household and institutional users. There are warm spots here around meat and poultry. So that makes up that overall hotspot for the meat products area. In fruit and veg, there is a little capital I here of hotspots for fresh fruit and vegetables in their different categories. And very sadly down here at institutions and hospitality, we have hotspots for wine and beer. A little bit of, the warm spots down here representing losses on farm and in processing for fruit and vegetables, which are to be expected. And cereals is a little bit high, partly just because of the volume of cereals that are actually produced. So that's for where the waste is, but that's just waste, and our target is to reduce waste. This is actually setting the thresholds here. For a warm spot is 50% above average rough distribution, while a hotspot is 400%. So you can sort of, if you're good at numbers, you might represent that this data is very spiky. There are some values which are much higher than other values within, being like twice the impact of something else only gets you a warm spot. You need to be 4 times higher to actually register a hotspot on this table. And we did set that so that we didn't have just everything looking hot. If we jump to climate change, and we can look again at the 4 impacts for climate change, we can see the hotspots in animal products very high because of the high production impacts and greenhouse gas impacts associated with the animal industries, and also down here in the shelf stable, which is by and large because you have animal products flowing into those shelf stable products. Everything else is cold, so that's a really quite dramatic. If we jump again to the 18 commodity level, we see that red meat for climate, because of the enteric methane and things associated with the red meat industry, is a major hotspot right from retail through to all consumption categories, and as well as these complex products down here. But we have some other hotspots here with dairy, cheese and milk, and some warm spots in the middle here with the fresh fruit and vegetables. We can then look, we also look at this with water. With water, we're looking for where we've got a lot of irrigation, so not so important in the red meat sector. Quite a lot of irrigation goes into dairy, fruit and vegetable production, and down here, nut production. So this is your almonds and other irrigated orchards. So we see quite a different picture when we look where the water hotspots are. And a hotspot down here actually in the losses of fruit at processing. If we look at land, it's all about, we have the actual physical, we use land occupation, which is the total number of hectares being occupied, which is not very fair to the red meat industry because they occupy a lot of very low value land, but we didn't really have a better land use metric available. This is just to get an idea of where there are some, what the sort of total land use savings might be as we reduce food waste in the future. So, you know, the downside of a hotspot is it means that there's impacts going on there. The upside is there is enormous potential to actually reduce those impacts with the strategies that are being developed out of this program. So, you know, every downside is also an opportunity. The final one is cost, and cost follows a bit similar to greenhouse gases because a lot of these high impact areas are also high cost. The animal products tend to cost more than, say, cereal products. The complex products are also tend to be more expensive per unit of underlying commodity going into them because they're evaluated. So look, that's a quick run through what the hotspots sort of look like and what we've done with those. And that what's really happened with all of that is that that has been feeding into our mapping into our intervention design and assessment. So the interventions have been driven by the hotspots and then tested against those hotspots within the scenario development. And we also have been developing a dashboard to be able to visualize some of that data to make it more generally useful.
Thanks, Tim.
Good
yeah,
segue.
awesome.
Yep.
Yeah, look, before we jump on to the next phase, I thought we could address some of the questions that are on the chat, if you don't mind. So I might just relay them to you. First question was, and I think you did answer this, does the definition of food waste, or have we accounted for the events of climate change, so floods, droughts, that sort of thing, or losses due to result of losses in supply chains?
So the losses due to disasters and things are not included. So freak events, you know, unless it actually gets into the statistics, that wouldn't be included. What was the second part of that?
Supply chain, losses in the supply chain.
Yeah, so losses in the supply chain are definitely included. We actually find when people think of the supply chain, there's often a thing about this long distribution chain. In the distribution part, you know, we don't see actually direct loss, you know, like a truck driving along the road and, you know, pumpkins falling off as they head to market. What more or less happens is that there are losses at the wholesale and retail that could happen because of failures in the supply chain and the distribution chain, but they wouldn't register there. They register further up because it's at that next stage, or maybe it's in your fridge where the food waste goes up because the cold chain or the supply chain has failed to really protect the product through that process. So, but yeah, waste is actually accounted at each step of the supply chain.
Great. And did we take into consideration loss of volumes in relation to freezing and evaporation through any of the processes? That was also one of the questions asked.
I think, well, for meat, yes.
Yeah, it was done for meat, yeah.
Yeah, where there's a mass balance thing, that would be accounted and not treated as a waste.
No.
Yeah.
Yep. One question I think that's worth addressing, and we haven't directly addressed it here, but I think it's worth us just having a discussion around next steps here, and while we aren't able to share it, but we can discuss it. How consistent are the definitions of food waste and other terms used in the study and across Australia and globally? And how does this impact the study in terms of data being collated? So I think it's just probably worth just touching on the edible versus inedible at this point, although we can't share the data related to that.
Yep. So I think I was almost going to put in the food waste definitions, but in here, energy use. So what's included in our waste and non-waste?
Landfill, composting, wastewater treatment, waste to energy,
On-farm disposal.
On-farm disposal.
Yep. So reuse and reincorporation into another product.
Yeah. So anything like food rescue, waste to animal feeds, waste that is reused. So for instance, in the meat industry, there's a lot of what could be considered waste that is then used to make fertilizer or other products, and that's not considered a waste as part of the definition of food waste here. Within
this part of the study, but it is an open and dynamic question as to what level of valorization constitutes it no longer being waste and now being a co-product, and that is open. But we've sort of stuck with the that categorization for now.
Yeah, great. Last question. Any way of knowing, measuring what percentage of waste is due to cold chain issues, although measured at the consumption of? Did we calculate the cold chain, the percentage of loss in cold chain?
No, because so much of our data is empirical. So we have waste data from the supermarket chains, and they don't tell us why it occurred. They just say that it occurred, and we saw higher levels in sort of smaller supermarkets and delis. But yeah, no one is actually telling us the causal reasons behind individual bits of loss, unfortunately.
Yep. Great. Look, just to answer some other questions on here, there was a question of whether these slides will be shared. They will be shared, and also if the data, some of the underlying data, will be made available for analysis. Where across the whole project, where we've made reference to another report or an existing published report that have been made available, there are some data sets that can't be made available, but they'll be outlined. Or that will be clear where that's the case. So I think that's everything. Is that everything from you, Tim?
Yep, that's everything from us.
Yep.
Okay, great. Fantastic. I'll jump in. So the next step, once we have got the 7.6 million tonnes, the question is how we halve that, and is it possible to halve that by 2030, and if so, how? So I think our process that we have here, I'm going to talk you through a little bit our method. I'm also going to talk you through how we've gone about designing the interventions and the scenarios. But once we do have the baseline, we have that now in the hotspots, we need to establish or determine which were the most appropriate levers to pull in order to most effectively address the key hotspots. So really, what is our best sort of pathway to reducing food waste, but also in a way that provides the most effective cost benefit. So obviously we can throw the kitchen sink at this, but it's going to cost a lot of money. And ultimately the whole point of this project is to identify the most effective pathway to reduce food waste at the most effective cost. So what we have done here is we developed up a long list of interventions, which I'll share with you shortly. There was a full list of 47 interventions. We grouped those interventions into scenarios. So by their characteristic, we applied them into different scenarios or levers. And then we modeled the impact of those scenarios and aligned to the baseline and to see what impact that would have. We're in the process of undertaking that cost benefit analysis, and ultimately what we're going to do is developing a recommended scenario. I can talk you through the first one of those. So here's our 47 different interventions that we developed. Now you'll see that they're broadly broken into comms-based interventions, government-led or government-led interventions, industry-led interventions. We've got market-based interventions, regulation-based interventions as well, and voluntary associations too. So these interventions were drafted from best practice around the world, from existing studies and policies, existing roadmaps that occur, but more importantly, they have been curated for the Australian context. One of the things that we established at the start of this is that there are several factors that made Australia unique compared to other countries in the world in our approach to addressing food waste. Our geography, our geography and the length of our supply chains, the intensity of our retail and how that works as well, a variety of different other factors that we need to take into consideration in how we designed these interventions. We then grouped those interventions into scenarios. In order for us to determine the best way forward to reduce our food waste or halve our food waste, we needed to look at what would happen if we had various different scenarios. So we grouped 4 different scenarios. The first one was current progress maintained. So that was really our current trajectory. In that scenario, we have kind of limited R&D funding. We have limited fiscal incentives. They're kind of based on what we're doing now. You know, it's not suggesting that this scenario did not assume that there was no increased progress, but really the progress would be increased at the current level that we have planned. So that means that the voluntary commitment that has already been planned has been put in place, and there would be some form of national behaviour change campaign, but really that's really around what our current investment is currently looking at. Policy-led, so that's a focus very much on the regulatory and legal tools available to government. That has probably limited focus on R&D or particularly market-based R&D and fiscal incentives. Instead, it also focuses on waste system transformation itself, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Industry-led, that's medium focus on R&D, no necessary broad fiscal incentive beyond what already exists, but a very much focus on increased voluntary commitment, and there are market-based changes to incentivize changes in the waste system. And then, of course, the final one is do everything. If you throw the kitchen sink at this issue, what is the outcomes going to be? And that, you know, and that's really a strong investment in innovation, fiscal incentives, high regulation, and a voluntary commitment that sits behind that high level of citizen engagement. So there's a little bit of nuance that sits behind those, but what's important to say is that it wasn't that these interventions were switched on and off. It wasn't that, for example, in the industry-led scenario, there was zero government intervention. But what we have suggested is that under these different scenarios, obviously there's going to be a greater weighting in the industry-led scenario to the abatement that occurs through the industry-led interventions. And of course, in the policy-led scenario, we've put the strength of the abatements towards the government-led or the regulation-led approaches. So that was our full list of interventions, and all of those interventions we have assigned some level of impact across those 4 scenarios. And we've currently built that into quite a significant model, which outlines the impact of those against the baseline, the hotspots that have been identified. Unfortunately, I can't share with you the trajectories of those today. We aren't quite ready to share that, unfortunately. But what I can do is talk you through what we do have is just a little bit more detail, I suppose, on the top interventions. Applying that 80-20 rule, we've actually done the CBA on not every single intervention, because doing the CBA on every intervention would be a very, very significant task. What we've done instead is done the CBA on the top 80%, so to speak, using the 80-20 rule. What are the 18 interventions that we think are going to have the biggest potential impact, to try and give us some level of cost benefit assumptions associated with that. Importantly, we found that data on costs is proving very hard to come by. And I know that a bunch of people on this call will have access to some cost assumptions and some both OPEX and CAPEX costs in relation to some of these interventions that would be we would really, really like for you to share with us. Now, we've had some concerns about, obviously IP and things like that. We're very happy to sign NDAs. If you do have any, if you have any costs, and I've got particularly outlined some gaps where some additional costs to help support us in our CBA would be very helpful. So I might ask you to share those as we go through some of these interventions, if you don't mind. So moving onwards, I'm just going to quickly run through these interventions very quickly and outline particularly where some additional costs might come. The other thing I'd say is that please do keep those questions coming in and we can address them at the end. We've still got 61 people on the line, so they're not, you guys aren't, I'm assuming you aren't bored yet, but we'll keep going. Communications focused interventions. So look, we're focusing primarily on two broad comms engagement pieces. The first one's an employee engagement behavior change, so engaging staff in mitigation opportunities across the supply chain, preparation, serving and disposal. We would love some additional costs for campaigns in that space. We have been in touch with a few different state-based agencies on the costs that they've done, but if we can get some information on various costs to run those national comms campaigns or national campaigns focusing on engagement in employee behavior, that would help us. Additionally, consumer behavior campaigns, so household nudge policies using behavior change theory to design more successful communication and information campaigns. Of course, we've seen those sort of campaigns. To some extent, there have been small scale ones here in Australia previously and much larger scale ones overseas. Of course, we already have some of those costs, but additional cost data in relation to that would be very helpful for us to ensure that our CBA modelling is on track. Industry-focused interventions. Again, these are just the ones that are in the, and again, there are more comms based interventions, but these are the only ones that we've seen as being the top 80%. Increased diversion of food waste to animal feed through policy regulation. This has proven to be one that has significant impact on food waste across the country. And when we started modelling this examining ways that diversion of food can be included, including inedible waste to animal feed. We would love some information on transportation costs to waste processing hubs of that waste that we have some already, but any additional information would be helpful there. Increased resale or donation of surplus food. That's obviously quite a common intervention that we've currently got running, but we're assuming a ratcheting up of that through the various scenarios. So surplus food sold and donated by leveraging IT technology that links sites with surplus food production. Invest in cold storage, of course, and cold chain improvements. That's another one. Menu planning, designing menus with food waste reduction in mind. Particularly looking at plate size there as well would be something that we're going to be looking into. New and amended processes for technologies that extend shelf life or stabilize surplus food. So we've been looking at a variety of different technologies there, and this is an interesting one, microfiltration of milks, freezing and pureeing of excess food. Obviously, this is a difficult one to cost because there are a range of different and new technologies that are emerging in this space. We've been struggling to get some of those CapEx and OPEX costs of these various shelf life extending technologies. If you know of a technology that's being currently put in place or being explored and have some ideas of costs for that, that'll be very helpful for us. Again, very happy to sign an NDA. This is just for the purposes of getting a good finger on the pulse on what this particular intervention is going to cost. And again, nutrient extraction for processing of waste. So we know that, for example, there are some companies out there that are extracting nutrients from existing outputs such as wine mark. And again, if you know of a technology that's occurring in this space and have any OPEX or CAPEX costs, be very helpful for us to get our hands on that. Development of centralized dark kitchens based on projects we've seen overseas. Having mass scale dark kitchens like those household delivery services seems to demonstrate significant food savings if you've got economies of scale. So that was one piece of the puzzle that we're looking into. Enabling harvesting and sorting of all grades of crops at an economic cost. So what we're suggesting is here the second grade product is more efficient ways to harvest those second grade crops and sort them effectively. This is particularly looking at sorting machines that can leverage and effectively sort those second grade crops, and we know that there's a market for that across the retail sector as well. Fiber products from fruit and vegetables, as well as improving manufacturing processes and technologies. Again, if we have any OPEX or CAPEX costs in relation to that, that'd be very helpful for us. Moving on to some market or regulatory focused interventions that we feel are in the top, in those top interventions at this stage. Low interest financing. So we know that there is some federal government funds that are out there for that. We're looking to see what might be eligible for those low interest funds, low interest financing, and what the cost of government might be for some of those opportunities. We're in the process of investigating that. Tax credits schemes, possible application for solid waste management as an incentive to engage in food waste reduction, extended allowable use by dates, and introduce, of course, the food waste voluntary agreement. So for these other areas that we are currently looking at the impact of that we feel as though make that top 80%. So that's kind of the list of, if we look again at this large list of, or this long list of interventions, I'll leave that up on the screen for a moment. We've just gone through some of the areas where we need additional data, and also some of those areas where we feel as though meet that top list of meet the list of, so that top 80% of reductions. So our next step here is to model those accordingly to the various different scenarios, and we will share that with you obviously when it's available, either through the final report or before. As I said, the next step for us is we're finalizing those scenarios, we're undertaking the CBA. We'll have that recommended scenario available by April, and that is basically going, where are we finding our best bang for buck? Is it all the way down the, it's likely that it's going to be a hybrid of these scenarios, identifying where we can get the best value or out of the spend, likely to be, a combination of both policy-led and industry-led. Of course, then we will develop the draft report and launch the report to everyone in July. So that's it from us for the time being in terms of an update. I might see and just quickly address any questions. Take me a moment to look through any of these questions.
Right, Max, Carolyn's got some questions that she's received already.
Yep. So one of the questions that we had was about what about developing the nation's road condition, climate, etc., and its contribution to the loss in distribution. I guess that comes back again to what Tim and Paul Antoine were saying about the distribution and supply chain losses are recorded as the products hit the wholesale and retail. Do we have anything else on that?
Not really from here. Just that, yeah, I think, obviously we need to look at causal solutions that address the causes of issues and not just the outcome. But it is tricky to model that.
Yeah, cool. the next question is similar, and I'm going to give you a policy response on that. Any way of knowing, measuring what percentage of waste is due to cold chain issues, although measured at the consumption stage at the end of the study? So Stop Food Waste Australia is working with the Commonwealth Government on a number of different interventions or kind of ways of working. And one of the programs is a sector action plan, and there's a sector action plan for the cold chain. And so that will actually do some of these things. It will better understand what's happening, work with the cold chain industry to understand that, document it, and then put in place ways of dealing with it. There's also the Cold Food Code, which the Australian Food Cold Chain Council has been developing and getting folks up to scratch on, starting with thermometers, really basic, how do you use a thermometer? So that's a really a useful thing, and that will be included in the sector action plan, which will be out September. So you'll be able to get some more information through Stop Food Waste Australia on the sector action plan for the cold chain at that time. There's a question here about biofuel space. Is there anything in the biofuel space from waste streams put forward as an option? That goes to the destinations, and the current destinations still include biofuels and that type of an outcome as a waste product. The only reuse of food is either food rescue or animal feed that counts currently in the destinations toward reduction of food waste. But biofuels is a different issue. Now, there's a couple more here. Do I have any more, Luke?
No more questions coming through.
Okay.
Give maybe another couple. I mean, yeah, the floor is open via the chat function if you want to. Here we go. We got the question from David G. Carolyn.
Okay. Do you want feedback on those specific interventions and suggestions for others? Specifically, David was querying the household waste stream. So the 47 different interventions that we've identified are those that, from international best practice and through particularly our partners with Edge RAP from the UK, have worked intensively with household waste streams. So the ones that we've got are reflect international best practice. And if you've got some other studies, love to send them through by all means. And we can have a look as we go into implementation. This is a feasibility study, kind of a snapshot of whether we can get there. And FIAL, as the Food and Agri Business Growth Center, is funding that to set the industries up to understand how to do these things. But the industries are going to be doing them, and the state and territory governments, particularly with households, are going to be taking these on board. So if you've got some good ideas, great. We'd love to hear them.
Excellent. I was going to suggest if there's any other questions to send them at info@fial.com.au. I will be sending everyone today an email with the slides and that link to the email address. Pretty much, I think that's it, everyone.
I think we're done.
Thank you to all our presenters and for everyone attending today. It's been fantastic. So keep an eye on our events page on the FIAL website for future webinars.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, all.
Bye.
Bye.